Hey there. Tonight we're about to step behind the bar of history and pour ourselves a tall, frothy pint of medieval life, warts, worms, and all. Picture this. You're surrounded by candlelight. The floor is sticky with spilled ale, and somewhere in the smoky back corner, a monk is quietly judging your life choices. But here's the twist. While most folks just wanted to avoid dying from drinking water, a few managed to invent loopholes so clever you'll never look at liquid bread the same way again. Stick around, because by the end of this journey, you'll learn why a medieval hangover might have been the most honest religious experience money couldn't buy. If you find yourself grinning in the dark, go ahead and tap like, maybe subscribe. Only if you're genuinely into these kinds of midnight tales. Let's make this a global bedtime bar crawl. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is, so we can see who else is sipping along tonight. Dim those lights, fluff your pillow, and settle in. The tavern's open, and tonight's special is drinking culture and alcohol in medieval Europe. Ready for a nightcap straight from the 13th century? Let's begin. So, imagine you're a peasant in 1200s Europe. No, you're not the mysterious, brooding type, unless mud stains and a suspicious rash count as mysterious. You've been up before dawn, hacking at frozen ground or wrangling some livestock that's smarter than you'd care to admit. The sun's barely over the hedge, your hands are raw, and your spine is writing passive-aggressive letters to your brain. You're parched, absolutely desperate for a drink. But instead of reaching for a crisp glass of water, you stagger straight for a battered mug of ale. Not because you're auditioning for medieval drunk history, but because, honestly, the water wants you dead. That's not an exaggeration. Medieval Europeans treated fresh water like it was a dare. Wells and rivers were basically open invitations for everything you didn't want in your body. Sewage, decomposing animals, and the odd unlucky traveler who failed. Swimming lesson number 1. People hadn't discovered germs yet, but they sure had noticed that everyone who drank from certain streams spent the night either clutching their stomach or getting plonked in the local graveyard. The solution? Invent small beer. It sounds adorable, but really, it's the world's least glamorous life hack. A low-alcohol, lightly fermented drink made from whatever grain you could scrounge and whatever yeast came floating by. Was it delicious? Not a chance. Was it strong? Only if you were a toddler. But it kept you alive, which is a pretty solid Yelp review for the Dark Ages. Small beer was the backbone of survival. Kids drank it, nuns drank it. Even monks, who, let's face it, were already a few steps ahead of the curve, drank it. In fact, sometimes I think monks invented half of Europe's problems just so they could invent the solutions, preferably in a big wooden tankard. The average medieval person put away almost a gallon of this stuff every day. A gallon. Not because they wanted to start the day with a breakfast brawl, but because water was, statistically speaking, more dangerous than jousting with a blindfold. That's not to say there weren't a few genuine enthusiasts. Some folks definitely leaned into the alcoholic side of things. And let's just say the villagers knew exactly who to avoid after the third bell. But for most, it wasn't about getting tipsy. Small beer was cheap, easy to make, and, especially in the colder, grimmer corners of Northern Europe, far more reliable than imported wine. For many, it wasn't just a beverage, it was a food group. Seriously. Small beer was liquid bread, calorie delivery in a cup, and, unlike actual bread, you didn't have to gnaw through a crust that could double as roofing material. And don't worry, if you're picturing medieval streets full of people weaving around like extras in a pirate movie, think again. Small beer only had about 1 or 2% alcohol, barely enough to take the edge off, just enough to murder the bacteria. But, as every student knows, you slam enough, weak, drinks on an empty stomach, and you'll still end up face down in the neighbor's turnip patch. Now, while the peasants were chugging mild brews just to outlive the next bout of dysentery. The monks were up to something a little more sophisticated. Let's talk about these guys, the original craft brewers. Picture a monastery, stone walls, echoing chants, a faint smell of parchment and regret. Between prayers and copying out the world's most passive-aggressive illuminated manuscripts, monks were quietly running the medieval equivalent of a microbrewery. And not just any microbrewery, one with centuries of tradition and a secret stash locked in the abbot's private chamber. Why monks, you ask? Well, monasteries were clean, at least by medieval standards, and full of educated men with enough time, patience, and access to large cauldrons to turn brewing into both science and art. Brewing was woven into the monastic daily routine, right alongside reciting prayers, fasting, and judging Brother Ambrose's spelling mistakes. They brewed for guests, for passing pilgrims, for charity, and, let's be real, mostly for themselves. Because if you're stuck in a stone building for life, you might as well perfect your IPA. Unlike your average peasant, who basically threw some grain into a pot and prayed for the least moldy outcome, monks brought order to the chaos. They wrote down recipes. They measured ingredients. They timed fermentation with the same seriousness they brought to vespers. And here's the kicker. They introduced hops. Yes, those bitter little flowers that let hipsters everywhere pretend they're connoisseurs. Hops not only added flavor, they helped preserve the beer, turning a risky homemade brew into something you could actually brag about. Now, while peasants sipped their 2% breakfast beers, monks had the luxury of making the strong stuff. Why? They had the ingredients, the know-how, and, most importantly, a theological loophole bigger than the church doors. During fasting, solid food was forbidden, but beer, perfectly acceptable. So monks doubled down on liquid bread, thick, hearty, calorie-loaded beer that filled the belly and, according to some, the soul. It was nourishing, boozy, and just rebellious enough to make Lent a little less miserable. Some monasteries got so good at brewing that their beer became the medieval equivalent of a regional brand. Locals would make pilgrimages, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for a pint with the brothers. By the 14th century, monastic brewing was a full-blown industry. Imagine Brother Gregory, beard to his belt, stirring a bubbling vat and perfecting his fermentation notes. Sorry, Chad in flannel, you've got nothing on these guys. To this day, you can still find beers bearing the names of those ancient abbeys. Turns out, if you want to stand the test of time, skip the sermons and start brewing. But let's step out of the cloister and into the real beating heart of medieval drinking culture, the tavern. Forget Instagram, forget Twitter, before social media, there was the tavern. This was where life happened. Weddings planned, debts settled, grudges nursed, and hangovers achieved. The tavern was the medieval intersection of the office, the town square, and the worst group chat you've ever been added to. News traveled fast, gossip traveled faster, and if you wanted to know who was on the outs with the bishop, you didn't check Facebook, you grabbed a seat by the fire. Picture the scene. A smoky room with a dirt or straw-covered floor, rough wooden benches that threaten to give you splinters in places you'd rather not mention, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have washed the mugs this week. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat, garlic, sweat, and the subtle notes of last week's spilled ale. On a busy night, you might hear a traveling musician strumming a lute in the corner, dice clattering over a barrel top, or a spontaneous pig auction kicking off between rounds. The drink menu, modest, mostly ale, sometimes cider, and if you were lucky or scandalously wealthy, a splash of wine. But nobody came for the variety, they came for the chaos. In a society where most people worked themselves to the bone from sunrise to sunset, the tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was a pressure valve. The one spot you could let off steam, argue about taxes, or discover to your horror that your neighbor was actually fluent in Latin after 3 pints. Taverns were the great equalizer. Peasants could rub elbows with merchants. Clergy could slum it with the blacksmith. And for a few glorious hours, everyone was just another thirsty soul. That is, until someone knocked over a jug. Then, all bets were off, and you'd better hope your Latin was as good as your left hook. Of course, not everyone saw the tavern as a force for community spirit. Church leaders denounced them as dens of sin, and city councils tried to regulate them with about the same success as herding geese. But the truth, taverns were essential, glorious, sticky, slightly dangerous hubs where communities held themselves together, or at least tried to remember where they left their dignity. Now, let's talk about who drank what, because medieval drinking wasn't a one-size-fits-all affair. It was a social hierarchy in a cup. Picture a wedding cake, wobbly, slightly lopsided, and probably with a goat asleep underneath. At the bottom, we have the peasants. Your average village laborer drank small beer or weak cider from sunup to sundown, not to get rowdy, but to survive. This was their water, their calories, their single affordable luxury in a life otherwise defined by blisters and back taxes. They drank from whatever was handy, wooden cups, clay jugs, or, if all else failed, their own hands. Getting drunk wasn't always the plan, but let's just say feast days often ended with someone waking up in a pile of hay, one shoe short, and a story nobody would believe. Go up a rung, and you hit the nobility. Here, drinking was about status. Nobles sipped wine, preferably imported, and so expensive you could have bought a small village for the price of a goblet. Wine was sweetened, perfumed, and spiced, because nothing says, "I'm better than you," like sipping something that smells like your grandmother's linen closet. Feasts at court were epic drinking marathons. Courses and refills went on until you wondered if the king's beard grew longer mid-toast. Getting drunk at court was not only common, it was practically expected, as long as you did it with style. Spilling wine on your tunic? Fine. Slurring your Latin? Also fine. Throwing up on the bishop's lap? That might get you a stern letter from Rome. And then, hovering in their own slightly tipsy orbit, were the monks and clergy. Technically celibate, occasionally sober, and always ready to bend the rules for a decent brew. Monasteries brewed beer for the masses, but priests, the lucky few, drank wine, strictly for sacramental purposes, which is medieval code for "I was tipsy before Vespers." Whether you were a peasant, a noble, or a monk with a suspiciously full mug, the golden rule was always the same: don't waste it. Alcohol was precious. Every drop represented someone's sweat, someone's harvest, someone's desperate attempt to survive another winter. You drank what you had, and you respected it. Unless, of course, you lost a bet with the baker and spent the night in the stocks. Drinking was the great equalizer. It dulled the aches of the poor, inflated the egos of the rich, and gave everyone an excuse to forget the relentless grind of medieval life, at least for a night. Some walked away with stories, some with hangovers, and a lucky few with legends that would echo through the tavern for years to come. And speaking of legends, you're probably wondering, what exactly filled those mugs and goblets? What did medieval people actually drink to unwind, survive, or celebrate another day of plague and papal taxes? Well, hang on to your tankard, because in the next round, we're diving straight into the heart of medieval drinks and feasting culture. All right, slide up to the bar, my favorite regular, because tonight we're pouring ourselves a tall, frothy pint of the Middle Ages. Picture yourself trudging home after a long day of dodging plagues, grumbling about taxes from Rome, and maybe outrunning a particularly aggressive goat. When it came time to unwind or just stay hydrated without dying, medieval folks didn't exactly have a lot of options, but what they did have was pure liquid history, sometimes delicious, sometimes questionable, always memorable. First up on our medieval tap list is ale, the backbone, the workhorse, the unsung hero of survival. Ale back then wasn't filtered, wasn't bubbly, and half the time you could practically spoon it out of the mug. They brewed it from barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't been claimed by rats or the Lord's taxman. You could order up a small beer for breakfast, or when you wanted to keep your wits, or opt for the regular stuff, hearty enough to get you through a double shift in the fields. And, of course, there was the infamous strong ale, the kind that made you believe you could debate theology, compose poetry, or maybe just see angels tap dancing on the rafters. Sometimes you might do all three at once, which was a real crowd pleaser at the village inn. Now, if ale was the medieval plumber, keeping things flowing in the populace, well, regular, then mead was the bard with a flair for drama and a suspiciously intense gaze. Made from fermented honey and water, mead was sweet, dangerously potent, and always the star of any feast where someone wanted to feel a little bit legendary. Mead was for people who thought beer was too basic and wanted a drink that practically came with its own mythology. One sip, and suddenly everyone's a Viking, or at least thinks they're one, until they realize their sword is just a soup spoon and their helmet is the neighbor's salad bowl. Let's not forget wine, the drink of choice for the rich, the monks, and anyone lucky enough to live in southern Europe where grapes grew like weeds and morals sometimes wilted in the sun. But don't get any fancy ideas. Medieval wine was usually a far cry from anything you'd pick up at a modern wine shop. It was often so tart it could strip the enamel off your teeth, and if you were lucky, it was only mixed with herbs and spices. If you were less lucky, someone might have tossed in a splash of seawater, because nothing says refined. Like sipping a goblet of regret that tastes faintly of the ocean and last week's fish. Cider and perry also made regular appearances, especially in regions dotted with apple and pear orchards. These drinks were fizzy-ish, sweet, and downright dangerous, because they went down a little too easily. One mug could turn into 4 before you remembered you were supposed to get up at dawn to chase pigs or attend confession. And trust me, confessing after cider was a medieval rite of passage. But you know what? Medieval drinkers didn't stop at the basics. Things got experimental. Ever heard of braggot? Imagine if beer and mead had a wild fling and produced something so strong it could remove paint and lower inhibitions in record time. Or posset, a steamy concoction of curdled milk and ale, foamy and thick, like someone tried to invent soup out of spite and a lack of options. There were also medicinal brews, wines infused with herbs that promised to cure everything from headaches to demons. Did they work? Probably not. But after a few cups, nobody cared enough to check. And for the truly brave or the tragically hungover, there was ale mixed with raw egg. Was it supposed to make you stronger? Maybe. Did it taste like regret and bad decisions? Absolutely. If you survived, you got bragging rights, and possibly a new appreciation for water, which, let's be honest, was usually more dangerous to drink than anything else on the menu. Now, if you think medieval folks kept their drinking casual, wait until you get a seat at one of their feasts. These weren't your grandma's Sunday dinners. Feasts in the Middle Ages were full-blown spectacles, carnivals of meat, music, and enough booze to float a ship. Getting drunk wasn't just tolerated, it was practically written into the seating plan. Every excuse was good enough for a feast. Weddings, holidays, the birth of a royal heir, the return of someone who hadn't died on crusade, or just because the Lord wanted to show off his new goblet, shaped like a falcon, and his collection of questionable jokes. Drinking started early and ended only when people ran out of stories, energy, or consciousness. Wine, ale, and mead were poured by the gallon, and guests were expected to join in with gusto. Refusing a toast could get you labeled rude, suspicious, or even unpatriotic. In some courts, it was basically a minor felony. Toasts weren't just cheers, they were mini performances, complete with speeches, blessings, and the occasional thinly veiled insult wrapped up in a poem. Between toasts, it was all about eating, drinking, and launching into increasingly questionable decisions. The nobles sipped from elaborate goblets made of gold, silver, or even carved horn, because if you're going to get sloshed, you might as well look impressive doing it. Meanwhile, servants scurried around with pitchers, refilling mugs, clearing away the trencher, plates made of hard bread, and quietly passing judgment on everyone's table manners. As the night wore on and decorum faded, feasts often descended into a glorious mess of singing, impromptu wrestling matches, and rambling stories no one really wanted to hear. There are actual records of people dueling over who told the better joke, or whose beard was more majestic, a real medieval flex, if ever there was one. Entertainers would show up, too, minstrels, dancers, jugglers, or that one guy who, after too much mead, would delight the crowd with questionable shadow puppets. If you played your cards right, you'd stagger home full of roast goose and good cheer. If you didn't, you'd wake up under the table next to a jester, a broken lute, and a vague sense of shame, swearing never to drink again. Well, at least until next week. Feasts in the Middle Ages were the original recipe for structured chaos, with alcohol as both the glue and the accelerant. So, now that you're primed on what medieval folks were actually pouring into their goblets, let's take things up a notch. If you thought beer pong was the peak of human civilization, allow me to introduce you to the chaotic world of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were high, the rules were vague, and the chance of injury hovered somewhere around, absolutely. Think modern drinking games are wild. Medieval party chaos took things to a whole new level. Rules were optional, dignity was rare, and the main prize was simply making it to sunrise with your trousers and your reputation, at least mostly intact. If beer pong is today's standard, medieval folks will have laughed, then challenged you to a contest that started with a toast and ended with someone face down in a cabbage patch. Let's step into your typical medieval tavern. The air is thick with the smell of spilled ale, sweat, and whatever passed for dinner last night. The tables are sticky, and everyone's elbow deep in their favorite pastime, drinking games. But don't expect neatly chalked brackets or a trophy at the end. These games were mostly invented on the spot, and policed by whoever hadn't started seeing double yet. One crowd favorite, toasting wars. Imagine you, a few friends, and a growing pile of empty jugs. You each take turns proposing toasts, not with clever words, but with sheer persistence. The goal is to outlast everyone else, round after round, while toasting the king, the local pig, or your neighbor's suspiciously handsome goat. Forget clever rhymes. By the 5th round, you're lucky if you can remember your own name, let alone why you started toasting in the first place. Another classic, dice games. No fancy casino chips here, just crude dice carved from animal bone, rolling across a rough-hewn table. You're betting your drink, your last coin, or, if you're feeling especially bold, or perhaps just foolish, a favor you'll probably regret tomorrow. The rules. They shift faster than your ability to focus after 3 mugs of mead. If someone accuses another of cheating, congratulations. You just invented the medieval bar brawl. But we'll get to that glorious disaster in the next round. There was also the self-explanatory, who can drink the most, the fastest. Not exactly subtle, but wildly popular. It wasn't about winning, really. It was about bragging rights. Who could down the most ale before collapsing into the nearest hedge? Medieval men wore their drinking prowess like a suit of armor, even if the only battle was against their own stomachs. And yes, the aftermath often included some quality time with the village livestock. Among the upper crust, things got a little fancier. Picture a candlelit feast, velvet banners, roasted boar, and goblets overflowing with wine. Here, drinking games were wrapped in rituals. Maybe a lady challenges her knight to drain a goblet in her honor. He stands, swears a flowery oath, and throws back his drink while composing a poem, trying desperately not to hiccup through the rhymes. If he belches, well, that's just part of the performance. Physical games weren't off the menu either. Think balance contests, stand on one leg, spin around, try not to faceplant into the roast goose. If the mood really got out of hand, impromptu wrestling matches erupted. Someone always ended up grappling with the local minstrel, convinced he was an ogre in disguise. These games weren't about skill. They were about drinking more, laughing harder, and stress testing the durability of medieval furniture. But here's the real twist. While most modern societies might frown on this level of excess, medieval Europe gave it a golden seal of approval, from the pulpit no less. You'd think the church would be the last place to find a drinking endorsement. But you'd be wrong. When it came to alcohol, the line between sin and sacrament was as blurry as your vision after a third flagon. Let's start with communion. Every Mass, the priest would lift his chalice, mutter some sacred words, and, abracadabra, the wine was now the literal blood of Christ. Then he'd drink it. Sometimes, several times a week, sometimes every day. Now, I'm not saying priests were doing keg stands in the nave, but the ritual meant a steady flow of wine, all in the name of salvation. If anyone asked, it was just holy hydration. And wine wasn't reserved for the altar. Monasteries, those quiet contemplative places, were the breweries and wineries of their day. For religious use, they claimed, but there always seemed to be enough left over for, let's call it, monkly meditation. Monks took great pride in their vintages, writing poetic tasting notes and praising the divine magic of fermentation. Sometimes their sermons ended with a bit of a slur, and the congregation just nodded along, pretending not to notice. Some saints practically became the patron protectors of partying. Take St. Bridget of Ireland. She once prayed for a lake of beer for the heavenly host. Yes, you heard that right. A holy happy hour in paradise. Then there's St. Arnold of Soissons, who allegedly saved thousands during a plague by telling everyone to drink beer instead of water. Was it science? Absolutely not. Was he right? Accidentally, yes. Turns out beer was safer than the local water, so sometimes faith and fermentation worked hand in hand. Religious festivals were basically medieval excuses to eat, drink, and be merry. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, they weren't just for solemn prayers. They were for feasting, singing, and warming your soul, not to mention your bloodstream, with plenty of ale or mead. Pilgrims crisscrossing Europe would regularly stop at monasteries, where hospitality meant bread, shelter, and just enough wine to make your next leg of the journey feel like an out-of-body experience. If you passed out under the altar, well, you were just extra devout that day. Now, the church did occasionally try to rein in the excess. Excessive drinking, a sin, they warned. But like most medieval rules, enforcement depended on who you were and how much trouble you caused. Nobles might get a finger-wagging sermon. Peasants could wind up in the stocks. A monk who got a bit too merry, he'd just find himself reassigned to more sobering duties, probably in the garden, as far from the wine cellar as possible. Here's the real secret. In a world where beer was often safer than water, everyone was bound to go overboard now and then. But there was a social line, cross it, and the fun stopped cold. When you slid from cheerfully tipsy to shouting at livestock and trying to joust random fence posts, that's when society stepped in with its favorite punishment, the dreaded stocks. Picture yourself waking up in the village square, ankles, wrists, or neck clamped tightly in a wooden frame. You're on full display. The town's children lob old cabbage at you. The local busybody tuts and shakes her head, and even the sheep seem to judge you. Getting put in the stocks for public drunkenness wasn't a rare event. If you were rowdy, foul-mouthed, vomited in a sacred spot, or, mooned the bishop, you'd find yourself locked in for a morning of shame and a lifetime of jokes at your expense. The punishment wasn't just physical. It was a public spectacle. Your friends, neighbors, and that one blacksmith's wife, who never misses a scandal, all got to watch you stew in your own regret. The monks might mutter scripture, the kids might throw turnips, but everyone got their entertainment. The real sting was social. You weren't a criminal, just someone who failed at the delicate art of not getting caught. Ironically, it wasn't the drinking that earned you punishment. It was being bad at it. Of course, social rank played a huge role. Nobles could drink themselves into oblivion at feasts with barely a raised eyebrow. But if you were a humble cobbler and tripped into the pig trough after 3 ales, suddenly it was a moral crisis. The logic. A drunk noble was eccentric. A drunk peasant was a threat to order. Authorities didn't really care about the drinking itself. What worried them was unpredictability. Slurred speech and stumbling around were fine behind closed doors. But let it spill out into the street, and you had the makings of a revolt. Or, even worse, a new folk song. Some towns even had official ale tasters. Their job? Make sure the beer wasn't too strong, or at least not stronger than the mayor's personal limit. If you're picturing a medieval health inspector, just swap the tipboard for a tankard, and you're pretty much there. Still, being drunk in public was rarely a true crime. It was more like a slap on the wrist, a minor disgrace. You weren't a hardened criminal, just someone who got a little too medieval on a Wednesday. After a few hours in the stocks, you'd hobble home, stiff and embarrassed, already plotting your next trip to the tavern, maybe a little quieter next time. Now, about those medieval hangovers. If you think modern remedies are grim, just wait. Imagine waking up on a lumpy straw mattress. The church bells are ringing like the end of days. There's a goat eyeing you suspiciously because you've accidentally claimed its stall as your new apartment. What did medieval folks do for hangovers? For most, the answer was simple: grit their teeth and get back to work. Chores didn't care about your headache, and neither did your neighbors. But there were a few brave souls who tried to cure their misery. Raw eggs mixed with ale was a popular choice. Yes, nothing says recovery like chasing last night's regret with a side of salmonella. Others swore by vinegar, fennel tea, or a handful of bitter herbs, remedies that tasted as bad as you felt. If you were wealthy enough to see a doctor, using the term generously, you'd hear something about imbalanced humors and probably get bled a little. Because nothing says feel better, like losing a pint of blood after losing your dignity. Some people just kept drinking. Really, the hair of the dog approach wasn't invented last week. Medieval folks figured if you already felt like death, why not top it off with one more mug of redemption? The church had a different prescription, though. A hangover was not just your body's revenge. It was divine punishment. The cure: repentance and fasting. If you think a headache is bad, try surviving on a crust of stale bread and a heavy dose of guilt. Honestly, most people didn't even call it a hangover. They just called it Thursday. But make no mistake, going overboard with booze had consequences. The only difference? You couldn't tweet about your shame. You just got up, wiped the ale from your face, and hoped nobody remembered what you did with that loot. And speaking of consequences, let's refill your cup and move on. Because where there's drinking, there are brawls, boundary-breaking women, miracle, medicines, and enough taxes to make even a monk blush. At some point in history, someone invented alcohol. And trust me, that's when things really get interesting. Picture this. The very first batch of anything alcoholic had barely been brewed before chaos erupted. someone was already getting whacked in the face with a mug. That's just how it goes, my friend. Step right up to our medieval tavern, where every night is open mic chaos, and your bar tab could include both a pint and a black eye. Let me pour you a frothy mug of medieval nightlife, a world where honor, ale, and your ability to sing off-key could all get you in trouble before the rooster crowed. Now, forget those cozy candlelit taverns from the movies. Real medieval alehouses were a wild jumble of noise, sweat, and smells you'd need divine intervention to describe. Imagine squeezing into a room already stuffed with muddy laborers, grimy blacksmiths, and farmers who'd just spent 12 hours arguing with their landlords and their livestock. Everybody's tired, everybody's thirsty, and one spilled drink is all it takes for someone's patience to snap like a brittle breadstick. Fights could break out over anything. A dice game that got a little too competitive. Someone bragging about their ox. The eternal debate over whose beard was more majestic. Or maybe just because you looked at someone and they decided you looked too French. Seriously, in some medieval towns, "you look too French" was fighting words. That's the kind of multicultural exchange you could expect after a few jugs of ale. Weapons in the tavern. Technically forbidden. But let's be honest, those rules were about as effective as a modern no smoking sign. In the back room of a 1990s dive bar, absolutely everyone ignored them. Daggers, cudgels, walking sticks, if it fit in your hand, it could be used to settle a score. Didn't bring a weapon. No big deal. There's always a heavy tankard or a wooden stool within reach. If you think a bar stool brawl is a modern invention, just ask the medieval tavern keepers, whose morning routine included counting the number of unbroken chairs. Sometimes the owner would try to break things up, but more often they'd lean against the wall, arms folded, mentally calculating how much it would cost to replace the furniture this time. Local constables only cared if things got truly out of hand, meaning someone died, or someone important ended up with the shiner. Two peasants going at it in the corner, while the lute player desperately tried to keep the party mood alive. That was just another Friday. But if a noble or a visiting merchant got roughed up, suddenly the law would swoop in, stocks would appear, and you could lose a month's wages, or worse, get banned from the tavern itself. Medieval exile, in other words. Still, everyone knew the risks. Drinking and fighting were just part of the package deal. You might come in for a laugh and a pint, and leave with a great story, a bruised ego, and a face you didn't want your grandmother to see until the swelling went down. But let's set aside the swinging fists and look at the hands mixing the drinks. Medieval drinking culture wasn't just a boys' club. In fact, if you ever bought a pint from a corner stall, chances are it was brewed, sold, and maybe even dumped over your head by a woman. Enter the alewife, medieval Europe's unsung hero, and the only person in town who could both make you tipsy and scold you for your language. Alewives weren't just dabbling in drink, they were the backbone of brewing for centuries. Brewing was considered women's domestic work, right up there with baking bread or churning butter. Except this chore came with the added bonus of getting the village blacksmith hammered on a Tuesday. Picture her, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, stirring a bubbling cauldron of malt and hops, while kids run underfoot and the neighbors line up at the window for a refill. These women brewed up small batches in their kitchens, pouring their product into jugs or offering it straight from the window. Some ran tiny tippling houses, think of them as medieval pop-up bars, while others expanded into full-blown public alehouses, which were basically the community's living room. And yes, there were risks. If her ale was too weak, too strong, or turned the local shepherd into a hallucinating chicken fighter, the alewife could be hauled up before the town council. Regulations were all over the place, changing with the town, the year, or just the mood of the local inspector. Prices were set by law, so if an alewife overcharged, or tried to stretch the ale with a bit too much water, she faced fines, public shaming, or even the ultimate humiliation, having to wear a giant paper hat reading "Bad Brewer." That's right. Forget bad Yelp reviews. Try drinking with a hat announcing your shame to the whole village. Inside the alehouses, tavern maids hustle between tables, pouring drinks, wiping spills, and dodging the wandering hands of guys named Oswald, who thought 3 teeth and a belly full of mutton made them irresistible. Tavern maids needed thick skin, a sharp tongue, and the reflexes of a cat. Some just wanted to earn a living. Others perfected the art of flirting for tips. And a lucky few married a rich, regular, and retired early. The medieval version of hitting the jackpot. But women weren't just behind the bar. They were often in front of it too. Sure, drunkenness wasn't exactly seen as ladylike. But let's be honest, after a week wrangling kids, livestock, and an uncooperative husband, sometimes you just needed a drink. Weddings, harvest festivals, or the rare evening off, and you'd find women joining in the fun, singing rowdy songs, and maybe, just maybe, letting loose a little more than polite society allowed. Now, what if you woke up feeling like you'd been trampled by a horse, or you gashed your leg in a ploughing accident, or maybe you were just feeling a bit too melancholy for comfort? Don't worry, because in the Middle Ages, someone was going to offer you alcohol. It might be your priest, your barber surgeon, or your grandmother, but the answer was always, have a drink. And sometimes it actually helped. Not because alcohol was a miracle cure, but because when you're feverish, dizzy, or bleeding, a few cups of wine will either dull the pain or make you forget you ever had a leg to begin with. Welcome to medieval medicine, where alcohol was the original painkiller, antiseptic, sedative, and, let's be honest, breakfast. Doctors, and I'm using that term very generously here, regularly prescribed wine or ale for just about anything. Got a cold? Warmed wine will fix you up. Headache? Try wine with a sprig of mint. Digestive issues? Mead with herbs, served in what might have been last night's soup bowl, and chased with a prayer for good luck. Even monks got in on the action, brewing up herbal liqueurs for healing. These were thick, syrupy brews, packed with whatever looked remotely medicinal in the monastery garden, wormwood, sage, you name it. Today we'd call those digestives. Back then, they were medicine, and the only test was whether you lived long enough to ask for seconds. Now, if you really wanted to impress your barber surgeon, you might try the boldest remedy of all, soaking herbs in brandy and downing the whole thing to cleanse the humours. Whether it did anything other than cleanse your dignity is up for debate. But at least you'd stop complaining, either because the pain was gone or you'd passed out. Medieval battlefield medicine took things to another level. Alcohol was the go-to for cleaning wounds. Though as anyone who's ever used hand sanitizer on a paper cut knows, cleaning is a generous word. Mostly, it just distracted you from the fact that someone was about to saw off your leg with an old farming tool. Sometimes the patient would get a strong drink before the amputation. Sometimes the doctor would take a swig first. Either way, the bottle made the rounds. But alcohol wasn't just for injuries. Feeling down? Drink. Plague symptoms? Drink. Childbirth recovery? You guessed it, drink. Spiritual despair? Pour another round. If you were alive and breathing, someone had a bottle ready for you. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it make things worse? Also sometimes. But in an age where bloodletting was considered science and leeches were more trusted than your neighbor, alcohol was at least the most enjoyable bad idea on the menu. Of course, wherever there's fun, there's a taxman lurking in the shadows. Medieval rulers had a superpower, spotting a good time and figuring out how to make money off it. Alcohol wasn't just a means to socialize. It was a full-blown economic engine. Brewing, selling, and serving created jobs, filled coffers, and gave authorities endless opportunities to invent dramatic new rules. Some towns even hired official ale tasters, ale conners, whose job was to check that the beer was up to snuff, legal, and frothy enough to keep the locals happy. Not a bad gig, as long as you didn't mind the risk of gout, or the occasional batch that tasted like pond water. Running a tavern, you needed a license. What counted as a license, though, depended on where you lived. In some places, it meant a stamped piece of parchment. In others, just a handshake with the local bailiff, and maybe a bag of onions for good measure. Serve ale without the proper paperwork, and you could be fined, shamed, or shut down faster than a lute solo that hit the wrong note. Prices were strictly regulated too. Imagine that, price caps on beer. Local officials would post the legal ale prices on boards, and anyone caught charging extra faced punishment. At least, that was the rule. In reality, if your ale was strong and your cousin worked for the mayor, you could get away with a lot. Medieval nepotism had a way of making even the strictest rules more flexible than a tavern stool after a busy weekend. And then there were the taxes. Ale taxes, wine taxes, malt taxes. Some places even taxed the drinking vessels. Picture getting fined because your mug was too fancy. Welcome to the joys of medieval capitalism. Of course, some people didn't have to pay. Monasteries and nobles often got tax exemptions, because nothing says servant of God like a cellar full of untaxed mead. Meanwhile, peasants paid levies on every batch they brewed, even if it tasted like disappointment and regret. But did all these rules and taxes slow down the drinking? Absolutely not. People just got creative. Some taverns operated on the sly, without licenses. Some brewers sold their wares out the back door. Others simply bribed the right official and hoped nobody checked the books too closely. What you ended up with was a thriving, slightly illegal, alcohol-soaked shadow economy built on loopholes, gossip, and the unbreakable human urge to unwind with a pint after a long, miserable day. So, medieval booze culture wasn't just about fun and games. It was big business, and business was absolutely booming. Over time, things started to change. The drinks got stronger, for one. Thanks to distillation, that magical process that turns wine into something that can both clean wounds and erase memories, new and potent spirits started appearing. Brandy, aquavit, water of life, the kind of stuff that would make beer look like child's play. And as trade routes expanded, exotic spices and new brewing techniques found their way to Europe. Sugar and rum followed close behind, and with every new shipment, the drinking habits of the continent evolved. Mead and ale, the old standbys, began to lose ground to imported wines and spirits, especially among the wealthy. Suddenly, sipping imported claret became the fashionable way to show off at the Renaissance dinner party. Even taverns got an upgrade. By the 16th century, some evolved into inns and public houses, the ancestors of your cozy local pub. Drinking became part of travel, politics, even the postal service. That's right. Medieval mailmen were known to drink on the job, and after reading some of the handwriting, you can see why. Then came the Reformation, splashing cold water and guilt on the whole party. Reformers like Calvin and Knox weren't too keen on public drunkenness. Overnight, taverns went from community centers to dens of sin, sloth, and truly questionable fiddle music. Laws got stricter. Licensing multiplied. Taxes climbed higher. Getting caught drunk was now a moral failing, not just a personal miscalculation. But people didn't stop drinking, they just adapted. Alewives got squeezed out by brewing guilds and big, male-run breweries. Wine was regulated by government officials. Spirits became the drink of choice for the upper crust. Drinking, once an everyday necessity, started to become more of a social event, something to be savored, or at least supervised, by the authorities. The Middle Ages faded, modernity marched in, and while we gained cleaner water and better plumbing, we also lost sight of just how central alcohol had been to survival, celebration, and daily life. For centuries, a pint of something strong was the glue that held communities together, or at least made them forget how much they disliked each other. So, before you finish your drink, raise a glass to all the alewives, the rowdy regulars, the tavern maids, the tax-dodging monks, and everyone else who made medieval drinking culture the raucous, inventive, and occasionally bruised mess that it was. Speaking of strange ways people coped with life's troubles, in our next round, we'll be leaving the tavern behind and heading somewhere even more unpredictable, the bedroom. Because in ancient Babylon, love was not a spontaneous, rosy-cheeked affair. It was something you conjured, cursed, or quite literally bottled. Stick around as we dive headfirst into the world of ancient love magic. Alright, pull up a stool at my bar, because tonight's special is a flight of ancient love magic, straight from the dustiest corners of Babylon, Greece, Rome, and Egypt. Forget swiping right or sending awkward late-night texts. In the ancient world, love wasn't a fluttery feeling or a Hallmark holiday. It was a full-scale siege. You wanted affection. You brought out the spiritual artillery. And if you were lucky, maybe the only thing you lost was your dignity rather than your soul. Let's start with Babylon, where the concept of romance had all the subtlety of a drunken brawl at closing time. Picture this. You're living in Babylon, the city where even the air tastes like incense and ambition. You've set your sights on someone. Maybe it's the neighbor's daughter. Maybe it's the merchant who sells the best figs in the market. Either way, you're not about to leave anything to chance. The Babylonians believed love could be summoned, controlled, and, if necessary, crushed, just like a clay mug under a heavy boot. Now, if your charm offensive failed, you didn't just wallow in heartbreak or write bad poetry. You'd grab a lump of clay and shape it into a figurine, ugly little thing, with your target's name scratched right across its chest. Think of it as the world's oldest voodoo doll, but with cuneiform instead of pins. You'd then bury it near your beloved's doorstep, as if planting evidence at a crime scene. No flowers, no chocolates, just a bit of necromancy to brighten their day. You see, in Babylon, love wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you did, sometimes to other people, sometimes to the gods, and occasionally to yourself, when things got desperate enough. If you wanted to go big, you'd call in Ishtar herself, the goddess of love and war, emphasis on the war. Ishtar was not your gentle, harp-strumming cherub. She once annihilated a mountain range because she got dumped, so she really understood the scorched earth approach to romance. Enchantments invoking Ishtar read more like legal threats than love letters. You'd have a priest or sorceress call on her to bend your target's will, and you'd throw in some hair, nail clippings, or a splash of blood for good measure, organic tokens to tie the ritual to the unlucky object of your affection. Sometimes you'd dissolve these in oil, burn them in a smoky fire, or tuck them inside a cloth pouch and bury it under the threshold, or hide it in the bed. Forget love notes. Babylonians left behind the magical equivalent of booby traps. And just a heads up, these spells had side effects. Sometimes the person would become infatuated, obsessed, or just plain unhinged. But hey, what's love without a little madness? And it wasn't just about attraction. If you wanted to fend off a rival, Babylonian magicians had apotropaic spells to banish unwanted suitors, or strip a competitor of their erotic appeal. In one particularly savage charm, a woman begged the gods to make her rival's breath smell like a corpse. Take that, romantic rival. If bad breath won't kill the mood, nothing will. So Babylonian love was a cosmic tug-of-war, with scrolls, dolls, and invisible spirits all getting dragged into the fray. Love was rarely mutual almost never gentle, and always a contest of wills. When words failed, you let the spells do the talking, carving your desires into clay and whispering them at the stars, then sealing the deal with sacred smoke. Babylon wasn't big on purity, but it sure knew how to make things potent. Now, let's hop across time and the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, where love magic was less about sweet nothings and more about desperate power moves. The Greeks didn't trust Cupid to deliver the goods. They had their own arsenal of options, some of which would make even your most unhinged ex look reasonable. The Greeks had two main categories for their love magic. First, you had the agoge spells. Think of these as magical lassos meant to drag someone, sometimes literally, into your arms. Usually employed by men, these spells were designed to inflame lust, cause restless nights, or even trigger full-on hallucinations until the victim was hopelessly obsessed. Imagine a typical agoge spell carved into a lead tablet. Burn her heart until she comes crawling to me. Not exactly subtle. The Greeks didn't do subtle. These tablets were heavy, durable, and cheap, perfect for burying in graveyards or wells, both considered doorways to the underworld. Why? Because to get what you wanted, you'd call on the dead. Ghosts who, frankly, didn't have much else on their schedule. You wanted someone to fall for you. Enlist a bored spirit from the local cemetery. It's basically the ancient equivalent of hiring a hacker to break into your crush's inbox. On the flip side, Greek women had their own magical toolkit, philia spells. These weren't about stoking wild desire, so much as keeping peace in the house, or keeping a wandering husband's pants zipped. Instead of unleashing a supernatural obsession, philia spells aimed for harmony, loyalty, and maybe a little tranquilizer effect on the side. You might dissolve these spells into wine or oil, slipping them into daily routines like a magical sedative. Dinner and a dose of docility. Cheers to that. The Greeks also loved their herbal aphrodisiacs. Mandrake root was a favorite. It looked a bit like a human, and rumor had it that it screamed when uprooted. Just the thing to set the mood, right? Other recipes called for honey, myrrh, and, for those who wanted to pull out all the stops, crushed bones mixed into drinks or smeared onto clothing. There's even a recipe that called for menstrual blood, believed to bind a lover's soul for eternity. Talk about commitment. Swipe left if you're squeamish. So, Greek love magic wasn't about mutual affection. It was about strategy, dominance, and sometimes outright coercion. Eros, their god of love, was depicted blindfolded and armed with arrows, not roses. Love wasn't just blind. It was dangerous, and the Greeks wielded it with all the subtlety of a lead tablet to the head. Now, let's shift to ancient Rome, where love magic got an upgrade, Roman style. The Greeks may have invented the binding spell, but the Romans made it bureaucratic, dramatic, and occasionally illegal. Love was a game of influence and status, with spells doubling as power plays and tools for revenge. In Rome, the most infamous spells were called defictiones, binding incantations etched onto thin sheets of lead, folded like cursed love notes, and hidden in tombs or tossed into rivers. The idea: trap your target's mind, body, and soul by invoking underworld deities like Pluto or Hecate. The writing ranged from pleading to menacing. You'd get lines like, "Let Victrix burn with love for me, Marcus, like a torch day and night, until she can no longer bear to be without me." Sounds intense. Until you realize Marcus buried his spell next to a child's grave, hoping for extra power. Nothing says romance like a graveyard at midnight. Roman women, meanwhile, had their own arsenal of oils and perfumes, spiked with herbs like verbena, mint, or belladonna, just enough to sedate or stimulate, depending on the effect you wanted. A woman who smelled particularly irresistible might have been dosing her intended with a microdose of magical manipulation. Forget pheromones. Try a dab of potion behind the ear and see what happens. If the potion didn't work, at least your target might wake up with a headache and a sense of existential dread. Sometimes that's progress. Then there was the infamous Venus wine, a love potion rumored to contain everything from animal parts to exotic herbs and, yes, bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were said to slip it into their masters' goblets, hoping to tilt the scales in their favor. If nothing else, the hangover could at least spark a little vulnerability. And if you're wondering whether this was all above board, Roman law technically recognized love magic, not as a romantic crime, but as a threat to public order, especially if it interfered with inheritance or property. You could make the Senate angry, but heaven help you if you disrupted someone's estate planning. So in Rome, love was political, magical, and just a little bit unhinged. It was less about passion and more about power plays, legal maneuvering, and the occasional supernatural assist. Finally, let's wander down the Nile to ancient Egypt, where love magic took on a sacred glow, equal parts poetry, prayer, and ruthless cunning. The Egyptians didn't just dabble in love magic, they elevated it to an art form, complete with papyrus spells, divine invocations, and a flair for the dramatic that would put any daytime soap to shame. If you were jilted in Egypt, you didn't mope, you conjured. Egyptian love spells mixed spiritual devotion with surgical precision. You'd see these spells written out in red ink, considered supercharged for magical potency, sometimes with little drawings of bound figures, or birds with clipped wings, in case the gods needed a visual nudge. The text read like love letters written in code. Let his heart flutter for me like a bird in a cage. Elegant, yes, but also a little bit terrifying. One of the most popular techniques was the dream spell. The spellcaster would call upon a god or demon to slip into someone's dreams, whispering lines like, "You long for her as the desert longs for rain." That's some serious poetic game, right there. But behind the lyricism was pure manipulation, an attempt to hijack the target's subconscious and plant the seeds of obsession. Physical objects carried weight too. Wax figurines, shaped to resemble the spellcaster and the target, were anointed with perfumes, pierced with needles, or sealed up in jars inscribed with love formulas. If you wanted passion, you'd rub the doll with lotus oil. If you wanted payback, you might add a dash of scorpion venom. Spells could swing from Cupid to Cobra in the blink of an eye. And, of course, there were potions. Because what's love magic without a little mixology? Egyptian love, potions often featured honey, wine, mandrake root, and, of course, blood. Some of the more stomach-churning recipes called for menstrual blood mixed with beer. This was believed to bind a man's soul to a woman through shared essence. Just imagine offering that up at a modern cocktail bar. Our special tonight is the Pharaoh's Passion. Comes with a little extra, intimacy. Any takers? What really set Egyptian love magic apart was its sense of the divine. These weren't just party tricks or desperate ploys. They were sacred rituals, backed by gods like Hathor, Isis, and Bes. Love and lust were seen as natural extensions of divine will, but that didn't stop mortals from trying to stack the deck with the right hymn, the perfect amulet, and a strong stomach for questionable ingredients. So, if you're ever feeling nostalgic for the good old days of dating, just remember, at least you don't have to drink a potion laced with hallucinogens, animal parts, and bodily fluids. Modern love may be complicated, but it rarely involves powdered mummy. Unless you're into some very niche subcultures, in which case, good luck. And with all these enchanted dolls, graveyard tablets, and unholy cocktails swirling in your glass, you might be asking yourself, what were these spells actually made of? What strange ingredients, curses, and daily rituals fueled this magical mayhem? And what legacy did they leave behind? Stick around, because in the next round, we'll uncover the raw materials of ancient love magic. All right, pull up a stool and let me slide you something special across the bar. Tonight's house cocktail. It's a blend I call the potion of questionable romance. Shaken, not stirred, with a dash of obsession, a splash of revenge, and just a hint of, please don't let this backfire. Trust me, you've never tasted history quite like this. You know those drinks with ingredients you can't pronounce, and you're not sure if they're legal, but you order them anyway because the bartender promises they'll change your life. Well, that's exactly how ancient love magic worked. Forget about roses or chocolate. Back then, if you wanted to win someone's affection, you'd be scouring your own bathroom for hair, scraping under your fingernails, or, brace yourself, collecting spit and blood. Why? Because the more intimate or forbidden the ingredient, the more punch it packed. Hair and nails weren't just gross leftovers. They were the main event, carrying your essence or your targets, like a medieval DNA sample kit. But don't think the ancients stopped at the personal stuff. Oh no. In Babylon, spell recipes had a chef's choice approach that would make Gordon Ramsay weep. Need your crush to notice you? Why not mix in a scrap of lion skin, a dollop of crocodile fat, or maybe a few feathers from an owl, the original night shift supervisor, since these creatures were thought to bridge the gap between the living and the mysterious other side. Imagine picking up a feather in the market and thinking, ah, yes, that'll really spice up my romantic life. Egyptians took it up a notch. Scorpion venom, anyone? They'd smear it on amulets or stir it into myrrh, creating a brew that supposedly inspired both desire and a healthy dose of terror. Nothing says romance like being slightly afraid for your life. Meanwhile in Rome, love spells sometimes called for the ashes of burned bones or the remains of executed criminals. If you couldn't win someone's heart with a nice poem or a decent haircut, why not borrow a little mojo from the dearly departed? It was less, let's go on a date, and more, I dare you to resist me, and also, here's a haunted necklace. Now, if you're feeling adventurous, picture yourself in ancient Greece, following a recipe that instructs you to procure the bones of a bat, grind them with honey and wine, and stash the whole mess under a moonlit statue of Aphrodite. The instructions then kindly suggest you drink this potion to inspire irresistible desire in your beloved. Of course, side effects may include actual madness. It's a real, drinks may contain nuts and a risk of losing your mind situation. Let's not forget, a lot of these old love potions danced dangerously close to the line between aphrodisiac and poison. Belladonna, mandrake, and henbane weren't just for the local apothecaries' do not touch shelf. In the right dose, they made you feel open, tingly, maybe a little reckless. Take just a bit too much, and your next stop was the family crypt, not the honeymoon suite. Till death do us part was less a promise and more a product warning. Now, it wasn't just men out there hurling spells in the hopes of a good time. Women had their own magical arsenal. Instead of dramatic curses, they often worked more discreetly. Think enchanted clothing, food laced with intent, or charm bags sewn with herbs that made your pillow smell like a sorcerer's garden. One Babylonian spell, for example, had women anoint their breasts with sacred oil before an embrace, turning a simple hug into a full-on magical event. You could say it was the ancient world's answer to setting the mood. But don't get too swept up in the idea of enchanted love as a mutual, rosy affair. Not every spell was about warm feelings and fluttering hearts. Some of these so-called love spells were, in fact, curses in disguise, poison apples with sugary words. The goal wasn't always attraction. Sometimes it was sheer domination. In ancient Greece and Rome, many of these spells were actually defixiones, or binding curses, designed to shatter someone's will and make them sleepless, obsessed, and emotionally shackled to the caster. They might sound sweet on the surface, May she think of no other man but me. But underneath, the mechanics were straight-up psychological warfare. A typical Greek curse would beg the gods of the underworld to bind not just the victim's heart, but their arms, legs, tongue, and even their more private parts, leaving them helpless unless they came crawling back. If you're picturing a lead tablet inscribed with these wishes, folded up tight and hidden away in a grave or tossed into a well at the crossroads, you're right on the money. The ancients knew all the best hiding places, where the worlds of gods and humans were said to overlap, and where, presumably, the Wi-Fi signal for magical requests was strongest. Now, if you really wanted to get creative, why not curse your rival too? Some spells went after the competition, making sure your romantic interest not only fell for you, but also lost all interest in anyone else. A notorious Carthaginian spell, for instance, cursed a rival woman with hair loss, a rotting voice, and, let's just say, reproductive system issues. Nothing says, "Please don't steal my boyfriend," like hoping your enemy's womb gets a magical timeout. Even Egypt, home of poetic love spells, wasn't immune to these darker urges. Some spells called on lion-headed deities to rip apart a person's peace of mind until they surrendered. Others used figurines of the target, stabbed, burned, or snapped in two, while chanting lines to bind their heart. The voodoo dolls. Please. The Egyptians were already on it with flair. But here's the thing about all this magic. It wasn't just for mysterious temple ceremonies or secretive midnight rituals. Love magic was woven right into daily life, as if it were as ordinary as brushing your teeth or pouring your morning ale. In marketplaces from Babylon to Athens, you didn't just buy figs and perfumes. You could pick up magical charms right alongside your groceries. Tiny amulets made of carnelian, hematite, or bronze, shaped like hands, eyes, or occasionally something a little more risque, all meant to attract love, ward off unwanted admirers, or lock down a wandering spouse. Picture a young woman pinning a charm inside her dress before heading out to catch someone's attention. Or a wife sliding an enchanted amulet under her mattress to make sure her husband's eyes didn't wander at the next feast. It was love insurance, paid in gemstones and whispered prayers. Food, too, was fair game for magical meddling. Meals weren't just prepared for flavor, they were cooked with intent. Roman women might stir aphrodisiacs into sauces, pour honeyed wine over herbs, whispered with spells, or bake bread kneaded with secret hopes. In Egypt, a spell suggested breathing into the cooking pot and repeating the beloved's name 3 times, as if a little steam could carry your feelings straight into someone's soul. Dinner became a slow burn enchantment, every bite a step closer to surrender. Cosmetics. Absolutely magical. Greek women ground special herbs into their eye makeup and lip stains, believing it would make their gaze simply irresistible. There's even a spell from the Hellenistic period that told women to recite lines to Aphrodite while applying rouge, turning a daily beauty routine into a mini ritual for seduction. Take that, influencer makeup tutorials. Even laundry got in on the action. Babylonian texts recommended washing a shirt in enchanted water before gifting it to a potential lover. If they put it on, the spell would supposedly bind them tighter than a toddler's shoelaces. Forget about love letters. Just sneak a little magic into the laundry basket. And these spells weren't dramatic, Broadway numbers. They were small, secretive, performed in kitchens, bedrooms, and bathhouses, by anyone and everyone. Love magic wasn't just for desperate wizards or bored aristocrats. It was for the farmer's daughter, the tavern owner, the guy next door with the slightly suspicious herbal collection. Now, before you get any ideas about brewing your own love potion, let's talk about the risks. Ancient love magic was never guaranteed to work, and when it did, the results could be catastrophic. Sure, some hopefuls dreamed of a perfect union, but the warning labels on these spells read more like horror stories. The same ritual meant to spark affection could also unleash sickness, madness, or the wrath of a seriously annoyed deity. Greek and Roman philosophers loved to roast these romantic risk-takers. Theophrastus laughed at anyone who trusted in love potions, painting them as gullible and desperate. Pliny the Elder outright declared love magic dangerous nonsense, practiced only by fools or crooks. Even the magical papyri, the ancient world's own terms and conditions, often slipped in a little fine print. Do not summon this spirit unless you're ready for what comes next. Spoiler alert, what came next was frequently a hot mess. One Roman tale tells of a man who, after a failed spell, wandered the night streets shouting the name of a woman he couldn't even remember. In another, a woman's attempt to keep her husband faithful backfired spectacularly. He became so obsessed and paranoid that he accused her of cheating at every turn, turning their once happy home into a daily episode of Who's Betraying Whom. And if you thought the gods would just let you meddle in people's hearts, think again. Call on Hathor or Isis without the right offerings, and you might find yourself on the receiving end of divine heartbreak. One Egyptian scroll warns, "If she is not meant to love you, your heart shall know sorrow tenfold." That's ancient for, maybe you should just swipe left. Of course, magic wasn't a one-way street. Targets of these spells sometimes fought back, hiring counter-magicians to break the enchantment or send a curse right back at the original caster. These magical feuds could escalate for years, with sword circles, protective charms, and bitter words flying like drunken insults at closing time. But here's the darkest twist. Even the spells that worked often didn't create real love. More often, they produced obsession, confusion, or empty compulsion. Victims might feel drawn to the spellcaster, but only in a hollow, haunted way, a reminder that you can force a body, but not a heart. Now, you might think all this has faded into dusty legend, but the legacy of ancient love magic is still bubbling in the world's cauldron. The gods of Babylon may be silent, and Roman curse tablets might be crumbling, but the hunger for magical romance is alive and well. It's just been rebranded. Those love potions, they show up today in the wellness aisle, teas, oils, and supplements, promising passion, attraction, and natural magnetism. Herbs like mandrake, damiana, and ginseng are still being brewed, just with trendier packaging and fewer bats. In southern Italy, you'll find folk traditions that are nearly carbon copies of old Roman and Greek spells. Red ribbons tied under mattresses, herbal sachets sewn into clothes, and charms whispered by grandmothers who definitely know more than they're telling. In North Africa and the Middle East, echoes of Egyptian and Babylonian spells still flicker in talismans and kitchen rituals. Even pop culture can't resist the allure. Vampires, love potions, and enchanted kisses are everywhere in movies, books, and songs. The love spell gone wrong is basically a Netflix genre unto itself, carrying the same ancient warning, try to force love, and chaos comes knocking. Modern psychology has even uncovered echoes of these old tricks, mirroring body language, using certain scents to spark memory, timing confessions for maximum impact. Maybe those ancient spellcasters were just the world's first dating coaches, dressing up psychological tactics in a robe and a dramatic incantation. Today, you don't need to trek to a temple. You can order a custom love spell on Etsy, or watch a Manifest Your Soulmate tutorial on TikTok that wouldn't look out of place in a Greek papyrus. It's the same old alchemy, just with pastel branding and a social media following. So, as you finish this particular cocktail, remember, ancient love magic wasn't just a desperate attempt to snag a date. It was a way to claw back some control from the wild tides of longing and loneliness, a beautifully human urge that hasn't changed a bit, even if the ingredients and rituals have. We're still chasing that secret recipe for being seen, desired, and chosen. And if you want a little magic to help, well, you wouldn't be the first to try. Now, before you ask for a refill on potions, let's clear the bar for something a bit more athletic. Because next up, we're heading to the stadium. Not the kind with nachos and foam fingers, but the ancient arenas where sweat, sacrifice, and spectacle were serious business. In ancient Greece, sport was not a pastime. It was something much stranger, and, as usual, a little bit darker than you might expect. Slide up to the bar, my friend, and let me pour you a triple shot of history's most sacred and spectacular sports, served neat, with a twist of divine expectation and a splash of bloodlust. Tonight, we're bouncing between ancient Greece, Rome, and the high drama courts of Mesoamerica, where athletics weren't just about showing off your abs. They could be your ticket to immortality, a political chess move, or sometimes the last thing you ever did. So grab your goblet and get comfortable. This round's on the house, but you might want to keep your clothes on, unlike the Greeks. Let's kick things off in ancient Greece, where sports were basically a full-on spiritual performance. Picture yourself standing in the sanctuary at Olympia, the air thick with incense and the nervous sweat of 1,000 competitors. It's 776 BCE, and you're not just here to flex for the crowd. You're here to honor Zeus himself. Forget casual pickup games. These guys trained for months, sometimes years, with coaches, priests, and the occasional philosopher chanting inspirational quotes before dawn. Before they even touched the starting line, athletes had to swear a sacred oath to Zeus, promising they'd played fair and prepared like true heroes. Break that oath, and you didn't just get a slap on the wrist. You could be publicly flogged or booted from the games in disgrace. And in this world, honor wasn't just a nice word. It was your ticket to eternal glory or instant shame. But if you're picturing bronze bodies in flowing robes, think again. Greek athletes did it all stark naked. That's right, no tunics, no loincloths, just bare skin and bravado. It was part celebration of the male form, part declaration that there was nothing up their sleeves, because they weren't wearing any. No armor, no secrets, just muscle, sweat, and the ever-watchful eyes of the gods above. The events themselves were a mix of simplicity and savagery. There were foot races so fast you'd swear Hermes himself was in the lineup, long jumps that defied gravity, discus and javelin throws that could take out an unlucky bystander, and wrestling matches that started sporting and ended with someone's dignity in the dirt. And then there was the pancration, a delightful blend of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules. You could break fingers, gouge eyes, and the crowd would still roar for more. Death wasn't the goal, but if it happened, well, that just added to the legend. And why did these guys risk it all? Not for gold medals or endorsement deals, but for a simple olive wreath and the promise of immortality. Win, and your hometown would treat you like a demigod. Free meals for life, front row seats at the theater, statues carved in marble, and poets writing odes about your thighs. For a brief shining moment, you were more than human. You were the chosen of Zeus himself. But ladies, don't get too excited. The ancient Olympics were a no-girls allowed affair. Women couldn't compete, and most couldn't even watch. The closest they got was the Heraia, a separate festival just for unmarried girls, featuring foot races and maybe a bit less olive oil. But let's be real, it was a sideshow compared to the testosterone-fueled main event. So, in Greece, sport was a sacred fire, part ritual, part legacy, part muscle-bound soap opera. It was war without weapons, a place where you could chase glory or die trying, all under the gaze of the gods. Now, let's stumble across the Mediterranean and refill our cup in Rome, where the sacred gave way to the spectacular, and athleticism usually meant someone's about to lose a limb. If the Greeks turned sport into a divine ritual, The Romans cranked it up to 11 and doused it in blood. Welcome to the gladiatorial games. Forget gentle athletic contests. Here, the Colosseum was the stage, and the main event was violence. Gladiators weren't just athletes. They were slaves, prisoners, or condemned criminals, tossed into a meat grinder for the entertainment of the masses. But here's the twist. Some of these fighters became celebrities, like Spartacus, whose name still echoes through history. He was admired, feared, and cheered on even as he fought for his life. Training was no joke. Gladiators learned their craft in special schools called ludi, run by grizzled veterans who'd already survived the arena. They practiced with wooden swords, took beatings that would make a linebacker cry, and learned to play to the crowd. The more dramatic the fight, the louder the cheers. And yes, sometimes women joined the carnage, because Rome was all about equal opportunity horror. The Colosseum itself was a marvel, 50,000 screaming fans, all jostling for a view of the next big splatter. Politicians and emperors threw these games for free, buying love with bread and circuses. Keep the people entertained, and they might not notice you're robbing them blind. It's the original reality show, with a lot more lions. Combat came in flavors, sword and shield for the heavyweights, net and trident for the sneaky types. Each matchup carefully planned to keep things spicy. And it wasn't just man versus man. There were mock naval battles, wild animal hunts, even public executions tossed in for variety. Athleticism met theatre, which then crashed headlong into horror. But here's something. Hollywood got almost completely wrong. Most gladiator battles didn't end in death. These fighters were investments, and nobody wanted to throw away a star player if they could help it. Most bouts ended when one guy tapped out, raising a finger and hoping the crowd would spare him. The real power was in the hands of the editor, the game's sponsor, who decided if the loser lived or died. And as for the famous thumbs up or thumbs down, that's probably a myth. The ancient texts are about as clear as a shot of cheap ouzo, so chalk the detail up to modern movie magic. Even so, some gladiators achieved rock star status. They got gifts, fan mail. Seriously, ancient graffiti has been found praising their thighs and other assets. Some even earned their freedom, retiring as trainers, bodyguards, or minor celebrities. The Colosseum was their stage, and the crowd their fickle, bloodthirsty audience. Now, for the next round, let's hop continents and time zones to the stone courts of Mesoamerica, where the line between sport, religion, and cosmic drama was blurrier than a late-night bar tab. The Mesoamerican ball game, known as Olamalisli, if you're feeling fancy, wasn't your average backyard soccer match. This was a sacred rite, a political statement, and sometimes a deadly game of fate. Imagine yourself on a sun-baked court, shaped like a giant capital, high. The walls sloping steeply upward, carved with images of gods, warriors, and the ever-present threat of sacrifice. The ball, a hefty chunk of solid rubber, weighing in at nearly 4 kilograms, about the size of a small watermelon, but a lot less forgiving. And here's the real kicker. You couldn't use your hands. Only hips, elbows, knees, and thighs. Try scoring a goal like that, especially when the target is a stone ring mounted high up on the wall. Every successful shot was a minor miracle, and the crowd knew it. But this was more than just a game. The ball court was a cosmic stage, a place where the eternal struggle between life and death, day and night, gods and mortals played out in real time. According to Maya myth, the original players were the hero twins from the Popol Vuh, who descended into the underworld to face off against the gods of death. Every game was a reenactment of that myth, a test of courage, skill, and maybe a touch of luck. And here's where things get dark. Ritual sacrifice wasn't just a rumor. It was baked into the rules of the most important matches. Not every game ended in death. But when the stakes were high, say during a religious festival or political showdown, someone was going to meet the gods. Sometimes it was the losing team, offered up as cosmic justice. But in some elite circles, the ultimate honor was reserved for the captain of the winning team, who got a one-way ticket to divine favor via a rather unpleasant exit. No pressure, right? The court itself echoed with the thud of the rubber ball, a heartbeat that pulsed through plazas and temples, carrying with it the hopes, fears, and identities of entire civilizations. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was theology in motion, a way to keep the universe in balance, and a reminder that every victory might come with a very steep price. So, whether you were wrestling naked in front of Zeus, dodging lions in Rome's greatest arena, or hurling yourself into the mythic abyss on a Mesoamerican court, ancient sports were never just games. They were rituals. They were power plays. They were a dance with the divine, and sometimes with death itself. Top off your drink, because our next destination is about to get even stranger. We're leaving behind naked Greeks, bloodthirsty Romans, and ball courts of doom to explore the mysteries of ritual and philosophy in Egypt, China, the Near East, and South Asia. When it came to physical activity, the ancient Egyptians blended leisure, ritual, and preparation for the afterlife. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next round. Slide up to the ancient bar counter, my friend, and let me pour you a pint of something truly unexpected. Now, don't picture stadiums roaring with the sound of 1,000 fans spilling overpriced beer on their tunics. In these civilizations, Egypt, China, the Near East, and South Asia, athleticism was a cocktail, part ceremony, part flex, and always with a twist of cosmic meaning. Ready for another historical round? Let's begin in Egypt, where every movement was a step in the eternal dance between order and chaos. Imagine you're a young Egyptian, sun beating down on your shaved head, called to the dusty courtyard outside your village. You think you're just wrestling a mate, maybe trying to show off for the local priestess. But actually, you're reenacting the struggle that keeps the universe from collapsing into chaos. Tomb walls from 4 millennia ago show you and your mates grappling in elaborate throws and holds. Think of it as the world's oldest judo tournament, only with more sand in your shorts. This wasn't just sweaty fun. Wrestling was a way to train up soldiers, sure, but it was also a ritual, a physical metaphor for the endless battle between Ma'at, the goddess of order, and the forces of chaos trying to sneak in every time someone dropped a beer. Now, if you were born with a fancier loincloth, say, a pharaoh, you wouldn't just wrestle. You'd be expected to master the bow. Picture yourself standing atop a thundering chariot, wind whipping your ceremonial kilt, while priests, nobles, and probably a few nervous horses look on. Your task? Shoot an arrow through a ring, so small it would make a modern Olympic archer sweat. Hit the mark, and you're not just showing off your aim. You're proving you're favored by the gods and worthy to rule. Miss, and, well, let's just say your next afterlife might involve a lot more paperwork. Archery displays weren't just for ego. They were straight-up political theater. Pharaohs needed to look strong, steady, and divinely approved. During festivals, entire crowds would gather to watch their ruler perform these feats, with priests chanting and nobles pretending not to be jealous. It was less about the sport and more about reminding everyone who was boss and who had the best insurance policy with the divine. But the Egyptians didn't stop with wrestling and archery. Rowing was also a big deal, especially along the Nile. Imagine a regatta, but with fewer yacht shoes and more linen kilts. Young men would row in perfect unison, their muscles straining as they honored the gods and recreated mythical journeys, like the solar boat of Ra sailing across the heavens. These events weren't just about getting from point A to point B without falling in. They were ceremonies meant to show discipline, teamwork, and a spiritual quest for balance. If you've ever tried to coordinate a group of friends for karaoke night, you know how miraculous that kind of unity can be. For everyday Egyptians, sports were woven into the fabric of daily life. Picture yourself joining a tug-of-war at a festival, leaping over your friends in acrobatic games, or dancing in rhythmic, communal celebrations that blurred the lines between exercise and worship. Kids practiced balancing acts and somersaults, while laborers kept fit through back-breaking work that probably made ancient CrossFit look tame. When festivals rolled around, the games became both an offering to the gods and a reason to come together, sweat and spirituality mixing like a potent, celebratory punch. And here's a twist you might not expect in your historical cocktail. Egyptian women stepped onto the athletic stage more than their sisters in many other ancient societies. Wall paintings show women dancing and performing gymnastics at banquets and ceremonies, their movements both athletic and deeply symbolic. These weren't just background acts. Their performances celebrated fertility, divine femininity, and the power of the body, even if they weren't exactly keeping Olympic scorecards. Let's refill your glass and hop over to ancient China, where sport was less about flexing and more about philosophy, etiquette, and, occasionally, the odd game of death-defying polo. Picture a Confucian nobleman with his silk robes perfectly spotless, at least for now, standing in a ceremonial hall. The air is thick with incense and the weight of tradition. Here, archery wasn't just a test of your aim. It was a test of your soul. Every movement, from the bow to the prescribed bows and ritual phrases, reflected your moral discipline. Hitting the target meant achieving inner harmony, like getting all your chakras aligned and then nailing the perfect trick shot. But not all Chinese sports were so meditative. Let's stir in a dose of danger, polo or jiju, which took off during the Han Dynasty and reached fever pitch under the Tang. Imagine emperors and aristocrats charging across the field, mallets swinging, robes flapping, and the very real possibility of being trampled by your own horse. This wasn't just a boys' club either. Tang Dynasty noblewomen, silk robes and all, joined in, proving that gender roles could sometimes be upended if you were brave enough to chase a ball on horseback. One emperor even met his end in a polo accident. Talk about going out in style. For those who preferred their feet on the ground, there was kuju, an early form of soccer. Soldiers first kicked a leather ball through a net to build agility and coordination. Think ancient boot camp with a side of footwork. Eventually, kuju crossed from the barracks to the city square, becoming wildly popular and earning a spot as the oldest documented football game on the planet. So next time you watch a penalty kick, just imagine a Chinese general silently judging your technique from the afterlife. Martial arts also found their place as sports, not just as ways to dish out bruises. Practices like Wu and early Kung Fu were as much about self-control and spiritual cultivation as they were about defense. Sparring matches and strength contests happened in public demonstrations, especially during festivals, where you could test your nerve and skill in front of the whole town. Even games like chess and Go were considered mental sports, with each move meant to affect your intellect and emotional steadiness. The ultimate Chinese athlete wasn't just strong or fast. He was a philosopher warrior, balanced and morally upright. The kind of guy who could out-wrestle you and then quote Confucius about it over drinks. Now, let's slide down the bar to the ancient Near East, a region that gave us empires, ziggurats, and more propaganda than the average political campaign. In Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Persia, sport didn't stand alone. Athleticism was a tool for showing off power, securing the favor of the gods, and, of course, keeping your soldiers from getting too soft between wars. Imagine you're a Sumerian hero, muscles gleaming under the hot sun, facing off in a wrestling match that's less about the trophy and more about proving your right to exist. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of epic grapples, so intense they nearly bring down the city walls, before the two competitors become best buds. Wrestling here wasn't just for glory. It was a handshake, a test of dominance, and a way to earn lifelong respect. If only modern networking events were half as exciting. Assyrian and Babylonian kings took things up a notch. Picture your ruler commissioning a relief of himself, wrestling a lion. No, not in a metaphorical sense, but actually trying to kill the thing with his bare hands. These weren't vanity projects. They were state-sponsored fitness ads, telling the world that the king could tame chaos and keep the cosmic order intact. The lion hunt wasn't just a sport. It was a full-blown political performance, with divine approval and imperial stability hanging in the balance. The Persians, meanwhile, took military training and turned it into a three-part harmony: ride a horse, shoot a bow, and always tell the truth. Think of it as the original triathlon, with the side order of moral education. Boys were drilled from a young age, blending athletics with ethics, so that by the time they grew up, they could fight, command, and negotiate, all without spilling their wine. Public athletic displays also made their way into temple festivals, where the gods got front row seats. Events ranged from foot races to stone lifting contests, to ceremonial fights, depending on which deity you were trying to impress. These competitions, watched by priests and kings alike, reinforced the idea that a strong body was as essential to the city as sturdy walls or reliable irrigation. And just to keep things interesting, the Near East threw in board games like the royal game of Ur. Not exactly a triathlon, but these games were serious business, mental duels that could even be used for divination. Win a game, and you might just convince everyone you had the gods on your side. Finally, let's take our drinks south, into the dust and drama of ancient South Asia. Here, physical culture was less about public spectacle and more about spiritual discipline, social hierarchy, and preparing for both war and enlightenment. The evidence might be a little less flashy. No Olympic stadiums, no lion wrestling kings. But the underlying philosophy was every bit as rich. Imagine wandering the city streets of Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro, surrounded by wide public baths and open courtyards. Maybe you stumble across a group practicing acrobatics, or catch a glimpse of dancers and wrestlers immortalized in terracotta. Athleticism here wasn't just about survival or looking good in a loincloth. It was woven into community rituals, water ceremonies, and the pursuit of harmony between body and mind. As the Vedic era dawned, things got even more intense. Training for young warriors was codified into Unravel, the science of warfare. Picture royal festivals where princes showed off their archery, chariot driving, and swordsmanship, all in hopes of securing alliances and bragging rights. Wrestling, called Malayuddha, became a spiritual path in itself. Wrestlers followed strict diets and moral codes, living almost like monks in akharas, traditional wrestling schools that doubled as temples. This was less about crushing your opponent and more about crushing your ego in pursuit of purity. And don't think they skipped the games just for fun. Ball games and dice games pop up in Sanskrit texts under the broad umbrella of Krida, or sport. Even the gods got in on the action. Krishna and Arjuna themselves are depicted competing, using their skills as metaphors for cosmic struggle. If you ever wanted an excuse for losing at dice, just claim you're reenacting a Hindu epic. Yoga also began here, and before you picture a gentle stretch on a beach at sunrise, know that early yoga was hardcore. It was a rigorous system of physical and mental discipline, designed to lead you to spiritual liberation, or at least to a really impressive headstand. So, what ties all these ancient sports together? Whether you're shooting arrows in the Egyptian sun, balancing on horseback in Tang, China, wrestling lions in Assyria, or meditating in a South Asian akhara, every movement was more than just a way to pass the time. Sports were rituals, training grounds for the soul, and sometimes elaborate acts of political theatre. Every leap, hold, or swing of the mallet was a message to the gods, to the people, and to the self. That order could be maintained, chaos could be battled, and, with the right combination of sweat and ceremony, even death could be cheated for a moment. But before you set down your goblet, let me tease the next round. You might think ancient sports were a men-only affair, but history's bar has a few surprises left to pour. Because, though often overlooked in historical accounts, women in the ancient world did participate in sports. And as our night at this pan-historical tavern continues, we'll see how their role in athletic culture, and how the very legacy of these games, echoes from ancient arenas all the way to the eerie tunnels of the Paris catacombs. Don't go anywhere. The next drink is about to get even stranger. Slide up to the bar, my friend, because tonight's house special is a double pour of history. One shot of ancient athleticism, chased by a tall glass of Parisian darkness. We're about to toast those unsung women of the sporting world, who, despite the odds, managed to work up a sweat in a society that often preferred them silent and unseen. And just when you're feeling that heady rush of empowerment, I'll be guiding you, torch in hand, down a spiral staircase into the bone-chilled underbelly of Paris. But first, let's work up an appetite with a little ancient cardio, shall we? So, picture yourself in ancient Greece. You've just sidestepped a symposium full of philosophers debating whether it's possible to be both wise and drunk, and you wander out toward the stadium, expecting the usual chorus of male athletes oiling themselves up for glory. But wait, there's a different energy in the air today. Young women, hair streaming wild, tunics hiked up scandalously above the knee, are lining up at the starting line. They're not just here to look pretty or cheer from the sidelines. Welcome to the Haraya, the original girls only Olympics, dedicated to Hera, queen of the gods and patron of marital drama. Now, don't go confusing this with the main Olympic Games. Those were strictly a no-girls-allowed affair. In fact, ancient Greek officials were so serious about keeping women out that the penalty for a married woman caught watching the men compete was death. Yes, death. Talk about the world's harshest bouncer. But the Haraya was different. Here, unmarried girls raced barefoot around the stadium, their hair wild and free, a pointed contrast to the decorum and veils expected of married women. No discus, throwing or wrestling in mud, but victory still meant glory. A crown of olive leaves, a statue in your honor, and a moment when even the gods might take notice. It wasn't just about winning. It was about being seen. Travel a little further south, and suddenly you're in Sparta. Forget everything you know about dainty maidens and fainting couches. In this city-state, the women are practically Olympic-level athletes. Spartan girls trained in running, wrestling, and hurling objects across the gymnasium, all in full view of the menfolk. It wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. The Spartans believed strong women made strong babies, and strong babies grew into warriors who could hold a shield with one hand and chug wine with the other. The rest of Greece looked on in horror, clutching their pearls and tutting about impropriety. But the Spartans, they handed their daughters a javelin and told them to get on with it. Meanwhile, let's swing over to ancient Egypt, where women didn't need a stadium to strut their stuff. Step into a sun-drenched festival, and you'll see women dancing, leaping, and twisting through the air in ways that would put your local gymnastics squad to shame. Tomb paintings immortalize these moments. Two women caught mid-somersault, legs arched, muscles taut, the crowd clapping along. These weren't sports in the way we think of them now, but don't let that fool you. The athleticism was real, the training was rigorous, and the performances pushed the limits of what a body could do. Sure, it was all in service of the gods or the pharaoh, but when the music started, you could almost hear the sound of history's first standing ovation. Now, if you're thirsty for something a little more gladiatorial, let's stagger into ancient Rome. Here, the social hierarchy is strict, the politics are cutthroat, and most women of the upper class wouldn't be caught dead breaking a sweat in public. But, and here's where it gets interesting, inscriptions and hidden graffiti tell us that some women did step into the arena as gladiatresses, female gladiators. Imagine the scene. The sand is hot, the crowd is roaring, and two women square off with swords and shields, fighting for survival and a fleeting taste of fame. It wasn't common, and it certainly wasn't celebrated by polite society, but it happened. Elsewhere, women played ball games, swam in ornate pools, and practiced horsemanship at private villas. Not exactly the Super Bowl halftime show, but a glimpse of athletic spirit all the same. Let's skip continents for a second and land in Tang Dynasty China. Here, the imperial courts are buzzing with rumors of scandal. But if you look past the silken poetry, you'll spot noble women playing polo. Yes, polo, on horseback, mallets swinging, robes billowing behind them. For a brief, heady moment, women and men competed side by side, ignoring the icy glares of Confucian chroniclers who would later try to write them out of history. These women weren't just breaking the rules, they were rewriting them, galloping straight into legend. And let's not forget the Mesoamericans, who took sports to a level of ritual and spectacle that would make even the most die-hard football fan pause. Their ball games weren't just for entertainment. They were woven into the fabric of life and death, with stakes that quite literally went beyond trophies. Thankfully, today's athletes can breathe easy. No human sacrifices at the end of a championship game, just a mountain of endorsements and a few questionable tattoos to commemorate the victory. So, what's the legacy of all this ancient sweat and spectacle? It's not just the gold medals and the Olympic flame, though those are obvious enough. It's the very structure of modern sports, the stadiums, the uniforms, the chants echoing across fields and arenas. The Greeks gave us the template, the Romans added the showmanship, and every culture that followed sprinkled its own secret ingredient into the mix. Think about it. When you see athletes lining up under stadium lights, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on the finish line, you're looking at a ritual as old as civilization. The opening ceremonies, the national anthems, the ceremonial oaths, even the laurel wreaths, these are all hand-me-downs from a world where victory was sacred and losing meant more than just a bruised ego. The Olympic flame, for example, is a direct descendant of the fire kept burning for Hestia, goddess of the hearth, in ancient Greece. Today it's about unity and fair play, but back then it was a matter of cosmic importance. Keep the flame alive, keep the world in balance. And then there's the Roman influence. Have you ever found yourself getting swept up in the madness of a stadium crowd? Faces painted, lungs hoarse from chanting, convinced that your team's victory is a matter of national pride. Congratulations, you're channeling your inner Roman. The grand arenas, the pageantry, the wild halftime shows, they all echo the gladiatorial spectacles of the Roman Empire. Even the way we obsess over uniforms and cheerleaders has roots in the imperial love for spectacle and identity. Don't forget the ritual side of things, either. When a modern athlete crosses themselves before a game or dedicates their win to a higher power, they're tapping into a tradition that goes back to the dawn of sport. The ancients saw athletic competition as a way to honor the gods, to prove one's worth, to carve a name into the marble of time. Today we might trade divine favor for social media followers, but the impulse is the same. Win, be remembered, become more than just a number on a jersey. And let's not act like the ancient world was all about brute force. Competition came in many flavors. Board games, archery contests, and feats of mental agility were just as important as foot races and wrestling matches. Some of those games, long forgotten, are making a comeback as history nerds and curious players dig them out of the dust and put them back in the spotlight. It's proof that the spirit of play, the thrill of competition, and the urge to show off just a little haven't changed all that much. But maybe the most striking thing about ancient sports is how they blurred the lines between the personal and the political, the sacred and the profane. Athletic events were stages for protest, declarations of identity, and moments of collective catharsis. When athletes today take a knee, speak out, or use their platform to challenge authority, they're part of a lineage that stretches back to those first barefooted girls sprinting around the ancient stadium, refusing to be invisible. Now, set down your imaginary olive crown and follow me to the next drink on tonight's menu, a Parisian cocktail with a hint of melancholy and a generous pour of the macabre. Imagine you're strolling the luminous boulevards of Paris, croissant in one hand, existential dread in the other, when you find yourself standing at the entrance to a spiral staircase marked catacombs. Down you go, leaving the sound of traffic and accordion music behind, each step sinking you deeper into silence and shadow. The air gets colder, the light grows thin, and suddenly you're standing in a world built entirely from human remains. Walls of skulls grin at you, femurs crisscrossed into neat patterns, and the occasional heart or cross formed from tibias, a kind of morbid interior design that somehow feels both reverent and deeply unsettling. Welcome to the Paris catacombs, a labyrinth stretching for over 200 miles beneath the city, housing the bones of more than 6 million souls. But how did this skeletal metropolis come to be? Let's rewind to the Roman era, when Paris was still in its architectural infancy. The city grew by carving out gigantic chunks of limestone from the bedrock, which they used to build cathedrals, palaces, and bridges. For centuries, these quarries hummed with activity, supplying stone for a city hungry for grandeur. But when the digging stopped, the empty tunnels remained, silent, empty, and forgotten. Fast forward to the 18th century, and Paris had a new problem. Too many dead, not enough space. The city's cemeteries, especially the notorious Saints' Innocents, had become grotesque pressure cookers. Bodies were crammed into graves, 6 or 7 layers deep, stacked like a grisly lasagna, until the ground itself started to give way. The stench was legendary. Locals complained about spoiled meat, foul water, and mysterious illnesses. Imagine living next door to that. Every dinner party comes with a whiff of eau de corpse. Eventually, things got so out of hand that the king tried to ban burials within the city limits. The church, however, wasn't thrilled about this. Cemeteries were sacred ground, after all, and nobody likes to give up prime real estate, especially when it comes with the added bonus of eternal rest. But when the walls of a wine cellar collapsed and spilled a wave of human remains into the street, even the most devout had to admit something had to change. So, in 1786, Parisian officials launched a project that was equal parts sanitation and spectacle. Under cover of darkness, workers draped in long robes moved cartloads of bones from overflowing graveyards into the abandoned limestone quarries. Priests trailed behind, chanting rites for the dead, while the streets above tried to pretend nothing unusual was happening. At first, the bones were dumped in haphazard piles, but eventually someone with an eye for the dramatic started stacking them into neat, decorative walls. Suddenly, the underworld of Paris became both a tomb and a monument, a place where the city's history rests in layers, each skull and femur a silent witness. And this boneyard ballet went on for decades. Saints. Innocence was just the beginning. Soon, bones from Saint-Eustache, Madeleine, and Montmartre joined the subterranean population. As more bodies arrived, the arrangements became more elaborate. Columns, hearts, even entire chapels, built from the bones of Parisians who once walked the avenues above. The catacombs are more than just a solution to a gruesome urban problem. They're a reminder that beneath the glamour of Paris lies a city built on both beauty and decay. For every sparkling monument above, there's a silent, watchful presence below. It's a memento mori on a grand scale, an eternal after-party for the millions who now rest in the city's deepest cellar. So, next time you raise a glass to victory or stare up at the stadium lights, remember, you're part of a tradition as old as humanity, one that celebrates not just strength and speed, but the strange, persistent urge to leave a mark, whether it's a footprint in the sand, a name on a trophy, or your skull stacked neatly in a Parisian tunnel. And if you're ready for another round, follow me a little deeper. Step into the ossuary section of the catacombs of Paris, and it becomes instantly clear this is no random bone dump. All right, slide your glass down the bar and settle in, because tonight's house special is a cocktail that's as dark and disorienting as a Parisian absinthe binge. The architecture, anonymity, and subcultures of the catacombs. I want you to picture yourself, not just in a bar, but in a stone-walled underworld, where the decor is, well, decidedly bony. Imagine the room around you shrinking, the ceiling dropping, and suddenly you're winding deeper into the catacombs, surrounded by the organized chaos of the ossuary. This isn't some haphazard pile of bones tossed down a hole after a particularly rough medieval party. No. What you see here is architecture, macabre, meticulous, and almost hypnotically symmetrical. Skulls stare out from the walls, stacked in lines so neat, you'd think a particularly OCD architect had a hand in the design. Femurs and tibias frame every row, as if the dead are politely holding up the ceiling just to keep things cozy for you. Look a little closer and you'll notice the bones aren't just stacked at random. Some walls form intricate patterns. There are hearts, crosses, and arches, all crafted out of human remains. It's a kind of skeletal wallpaper, the kind you'd find if Tim Burton ever opened a hotel in the afterlife. And this transformation didn't just happen because some bored gravedigger wanted to show off his artistic side. In the early 19th century, a man named Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury, inspector of quarries and accidental interior decorator of the dead, took over the project. Before Héricard showed up, bones had just been dumped in big, grim heaps, out of sight and out of mind, like the medieval version of shoving your dirty laundry under the bed. But Héricard had a grander vision. He believed the catacombs could be more than a dumping ground. They could become a monument. A place where the living could reflect on the fleeting nature of life, a little like the world's most depressing, motivational poster. Under his direction, the ossuary was cleaned up, reorganized, and transformed into the haunting gallery you see today. Suddenly, the bones were not only stored, they were displayed, arranged, and immortalized in a subterranean artwork that was as much about aesthetics as it was about engineering. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The bones themselves, taken from millions of Parisians, are totally anonymous. There are no names, no dates, no, here lies Pierre, champion cheesemonger and undefeated tavern brawler. Just endless shelves of bones, each indistinguishable from the next. The only clues are small plaques, little stone markers that tell you which cemetery the bones came from and the year they were moved. In some corners, you'll spot poetic inscriptions carved into the rock. One of the most famous reads, "Arrête, c'est ici l'empire de la mort," or, "Stop, this is the empire of death." Nothing like a friendly reminder to mind your step. But don't think for a second this was all about art and philosophy. Structural stability was a real concern down here. The bones weren't just for show, they were essential for reinforcing the tunnels. In many places, bones are packed tight behind stone retaining walls, their only job now to hold up the ceiling above. Imagine that. Your final act of public service is as a load-bearing femur beneath Paris. Engineers had to be careful. These tunnels run directly beneath the city, and a collapse wouldn't just ruin a few tourists' day. It could bring down entire neighborhoods. So, next time you're sipping wine on the left bank, just remember, you might be standing on 6 million skeletons, all doing their bit to keep your table upright. Lighting in the early days was less than comforting. Picture yourself walking through these corridors, with nothing but a guttering oil lamp or a smoky torch. Shadows flicker and dance across the eye sockets and rib cages, making even the bravest monk reconsider his vow of sobriety. Today, electric lights have made the catacombs less ominous, but the effect is no less surreal. It's like wandering through a mausoleum designed by someone who couldn't decide between Gothic drama and minimalist chic. And this isn't just an ossuary, it's a carefully engineered underworld, a blend of practicality, respect, and a dash of showmanship. The space is meant to humble the living and give silent voice to the dead. Every wall is a reminder. Architecture isn't always about what's above ground. Sometimes the most powerful structures are hidden below, made from the things we'd rather not think about. Now, take a few steps deeper with me. The further you go, the more the faces blur, because there aren't any. 6 million bodies, stripped of identity, reduced to anonymous bones. No names, no epitaphs. Just endless rows of skulls, watching in silence. The question that starts to crawl up your spine, who were these people? The answer? Everyone. The catacombs house the remains of generations of Parisians, bakers, maids, soldiers, midwives, priests, children, anyone who lived and died in the teeming streets above. Imagine a bustling medieval city. The markets stink of fish and sweat. The churches echo with prayer, and neighborhoods are so overcrowded that even the rats are elbowing each other. When the cemeteries overflowed and the stench became impossible to ignore, the bodies were moved here. They became part of this grand subterranean archive of mortality. Some bones belonged to plague victims, especially those unlucky enough to catch the Black Death or later cholera outbreaks. Disease wiped people out so quickly that cemeteries became mass graves, and eventually those graves were emptied into the catacombs. Others died in famines, house fires, or in childbirth. Some had been buried for centuries and arrived in the catacombs as tidy skeletons. Others were still, well, a little fresh. The process of relocating them was grim, unsentimental, and about as dignified as cleaning out the world's worst closet. It was a solution, not a ceremony. But it wasn't just commoners who ended up here. French nobles, clergymen, and even some revolutionary firebrands joined the crowd, especially when political chaos swept the city. During the French Revolution, when the guillotine was the hottest ticket in town, victims were dumped in mass graves and eventually spirited away to the catacombs. Rumor has it that some bones belong to big names like Danton, Robespierre, or Camille Desmoulins, but nobody knows for sure. Down here, titles and ranks vanish. Everyone is equal, peasant, poet, or patriot, all reduced to geometry in the darkness. There's even a section believed to hold the bones of monks and nuns, moved from their convent gardens when Paris needed more real estate for the dead. And don't forget the children. You'll spot smaller bones among the stacks, a somber reminder of lives cut short, marked by nothing but silence. By design, the catacombs erase all identity. In death, everyone is equal. The anonymity is overwhelming, but in their silence, these bones speak volumes. They tell us about the weight of history, the cost of city life, and the way a society handled being constantly surrounded by death. Once, Parisians pressed shoulder to shoulder on the streets. Now, they rest skull to skull beneath them. Let's break the somber mood for a second and shift our scene. While most tourists stick to the official, polished mile of catacombs, well lit and sanitized for your protection, there's a whole other world lurking beneath your feet. Imagine discovering a hidden door in your favorite bar, pushing it open, and stumbling into a shadowy network of forbidden tunnels. Locked gates, unmapped corridors, graffiti-covered chambers, and, if you're lucky, the echoes of a secret party deep underground. Welcome to the world of the cataphiles, the underground explorers who treat the catacombs like their own private speakeasy. Cataphiles are a breed apart. They sneak into the forbidden sections of the catacombs, defying city law with all the enthusiasm of a teenager jumping the fence into the neighbor's pool. Their entrances are the stuff of urban legend. A manhole in a quiet park, a storm drain behind a supermarket, even a trapdoor in someone's basement. Once inside, they navigate by memory, hand-sketched maps, or pure stubbornness. There are no signs, no safety rails, and definitely no cell phone reception. Only the sound of your footsteps echoing in the dark, and maybe the distant laugh of someone who knows the tunnels better than you. But this isn't just thrill-seeking. For many cataphiles, the catacombs are a secret city, a sacred space where history, rebellion, and creativity all come together. Over the years, they dug out rooms in the tunnels, built makeshift libraries, set up art galleries, and even installed underground cinemas. Some host clandestine parties, where a generator powers the music, candles flicker, and the dance floor is nothing more than a slab of stone laid over centuries-old bones. The cataphile community is tight-knit and fiercely protective of its secrets. Entry is usually by invitation only. If you're new, you're called a tourist, and you're expected to prove yourself, show respect, pay attention, and don't get lost. The golden rules. Never disturb the bones, never tag sacred sites, and absolutely never get caught. This is all illegal, after all. In 1955, French authorities banned unauthorized exploration of the catacombs. The dangers are real. Collapsing tunnels, sudden floods, crawl spaces so tight they'd make a rat claustrophobic, and dead ends that could trap even the most seasoned explorer. There have been injuries, arrests, and more than one disappearance. In one infamous case, a man vanished for days, only to be found delirious and dehydrated in a remote tunnel, rescued by search dogs who probably wondered what he'd been drinking. Still, the catacombs are too vast to police. Every time the authorities seal an entrance, another one is found. The cataphiles always come back. For them, the catacombs mean freedom, mystery, and a place where time loses its grip. Down here, the living and the dead share the same address, not out of fear, but out of respect for the strange, echoing history that fills these tunnels. If you wander deep enough, the silence isn't empty. It's filled with symbols, messages scratched into limestone, cryptic arrows, painted faces, and lines of poetry fading into the gloom. This is the secret language of the catacombs. The walls are a tapestry of graffiti, signs, and coded messages left by generations of quarry workers, cataphiles, and even the dead themselves. Some of the oldest marks are from quarrymen who carved their initials, dates, and hours into the rock to keep track of where they'd been. Others left behind sketches of pickaxes, candles, or even ships, practical graffiti for a place that could swallow you whole. As the catacombs became an ossuary, a new set of carvings appeared. Plaques from the 18th and 19th centuries label which cemetery the bones came from, sometimes with haunting epitaphs. Where is death? Always behind you. Or Stoic, Latin, reminders of mortality. But in the forbidden tunnels, modern hands have added their own voice. Cataphile graffiti exploded in the 20th century. Some pieces are truly works of art, murals painted by flashlight, walls transformed into glowing skeletons, mythical beasts, or surreal faces that seem to follow you down the corridor. Other markings are more practical, arrows pointing toward exits, nicknames etched in stone, coded directions that only insiders understand. The tunnels have their own unofficial map, passed down by word of mouth. Locations bear cryptic names: the beach, a sandy cavern, the cellar, the cathedral, the sandbox. Some walls get nicknames based on the images scrawled across them. There's the mushroom forest, the elephant room, and countless other landmarks that would make a medieval explorer's head spin. And there are clear signs of occupation. Candle holders carved into the rock, benches pieced together from scavenged stone, rusted hinges where doors once stood. Some explorers bring stencils or stamps and mark their visits, like passports in the world's most exclusive and illegal club. Others leave behind poems, bottle caps, or small figurines, a quiet offering to the darkness and the dead. Down here, language becomes legacy. Every scroll, every arrow, every faded mural tells a story. Someone was here. Someone passed through. Someone wanted to be remembered, if only for a fleeting moment, in a place where time and identity dissolve. So, refill your glass and take a breath of that cool subterranean air. We've wandered through the architecture, the anonymity, and the strange subcultures that haunt the catacombs. But our journey isn't over yet. Because while most people think of these tunnels as just a creepy tourist attraction, the truth is, they've played a much bigger role in the life and death of Paris. During times of war, the Paris catacombs were more than a macabre curiosity. All right, slide your glass a little closer across this creaking bar, because tonight I'm pouring you a story that's part underground thriller, part ghost tale, and part existential slap in the face. Picture this: you're in Paris, but instead of sipping wine on the boulevards, you're ducking into a crumbling stone archway, descending down a spiral staircase that seems to go on forever. Welcome to the city's real underbelly, the catacombs. And trust me, what happened down here during war isn't just some spooky side note. It's the kind of history that'll make your next hangover feel like a gentle breeze. During times of chaos and conflict, the catacombs weren't just a tourist curiosity or a dare for drunk students. These shadowy tunnels were Paris's secret weapon, literally. Imagine bombs raining down overhead, the city in turmoil, and you, one of thousands, slipping through a maze of bone-lined corridors below the chaos. It's not just a horror movie set, it's history, and you're smack in the middle of it. Let's rewind to the French Revolution for a second. Above ground, the guillotine was working overtime, heads tumbling, crowds jeering, and the city cemeteries overflowing like a medieval after-party gone wrong. Below ground, the catacombs were hard at work too, absorbing the endless supply of new residents. But it wasn't just a bone dump. Whispers spread that revolutionaries used these tunnels as their own covert subway system, darting from district to district, plotting uprisings in the dark while Paris slept, or at least pretended to. Now skip ahead to World War II. Paris is under Nazi occupation, and the city is tense, brittle as old bread. The German military, always thorough, decided the catacombs would make the perfect clandestine command center. They mapped the tunnels, set up bunkers, and even built a secret headquarters beneath the Lycée Montaigne. Imagine, concrete walls, radio wires snaking along stone, murmurs of orders echoing where only the dead used to listen. But if you think the Nazis had the place to themselves, think again. The French resistance, those masters of improvisation, slipped through the tunnels like ghosts with a grudge, armed with nothing but grit and the kind of homemade maps that would make Google cry. They staged ambushes, ferried weapons, and held meetings in the torchlit gloom. It was the world's deadliest game of hide and seek, one level below the boots of the occupiers. Cataphiles, those local tunnel rats who knew every crack and shortcut, suddenly found themselves as valuable as a barrel of brandy during Lent. With their help, the labyrinth became a rebel stronghold. Evidence of these wartime shenanigans still lingers if you know where to look. A faded piece of graffiti, a battered ration can, a wall blackened by fire. Some passages were turned into bomb shelters, where ordinary Parisians huddled in the dark, families pressed between centuries-old bones and the distant rumble of falling bombs. Imagine being a kid down there, clutching your mother's hand, knowing that above, history is exploding while below, you're sharing space with 6 million silent witnesses. After the war, a lot of these secret sections were bricked up or left to rot, but the city never quite managed to erase the traces. There are rusted doors, piles of old gas mask filters, the odd scorched inscription on the wall. Tiny reminders that beneath Paris, the story never really stops. And where there are bones, you can bet your last copper coin there are stories. The catacombs aren't just a storage locker for skeletons. They're a breeding ground for legends, the kind you only whisper about after your third drink, when the lights are low and the shadows get chatty. Let's start with the classic, the Phantom of the Catacombs. Some say he's the spirit of a long-lost quarryman, condemned to wander the tunnels for eternity, his heavy boots echoing through the stone while the living shiver upstairs. Others claim he's a plague victim, doomed to search forever for his family, among the endless rows of skulls. Real or not, visitors swear they hear footsteps in the dark, feel icy draughts brush their necks, or get hit with sudden waves of nausea in certain silent corners. Especially in those untouched ossuaries, where bones haven't seen daylight in centuries. Now, brace yourself for a dash of 1990s found footage horror. There's a story about a camcorder discovered deep in a forbidden section of the catacombs. The tape, later splashed across French TV, shows a man stumbling through the tunnels, flashlight flickering, panic mounting as he twists and turns, deeper and deeper, until finally the camera drops and the screen goes black. No one ever figured out who he was or what became of him. The urban legend? He's still down there, just another ghost in the crowd of bones. If that's not enough, try this on for size. Stories of secret rooms lined with bones arranged into thrones and chairs, or rumors of underground cults carrying out rituals by candlelight, while the city above blithely checks Instagram. In the early 2000s, explorers stumbled across a sealed chamber that had everything you'd need for a proper subterranean party. A working phone line, a fully stocked bar, and even an underground cinema. On the wall, in spray paint, a message, "Do not try to find us." That's either the world's most exclusive club or a horror movie waiting to happen. Sure, some of these tales are probably tall, but try telling that to anyone who's spent a night in the tunnels. The catacombs feed on our fear of the dark, the unknown, and the unsettling reality that death is always lurking just out of sight. The bones are real enough. The stories, they live in the space between a flickering candle and the next echo down the hall. And here's the kicker. Today, the Paris catacombs are one of the city's hottest attractions. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people line up, not to visit loved ones or pray for souls, but to snag a selfie with a wall of skulls, to marvel at the architecture of mortality, to collect a souvenir shiver before heading out for crepes. What started as a grim necessity has become the city's strangest memento mori. Remember, you too will die, right there on your Instagram feed, complete with a filter. The official ossuary opened its doors to the public back in 1809. Back then, the idea was to inspire some quiet reflection. Early tours wound through the labyrinth by lantern light, sometimes led by priests in solemn procession or scholars eager to explain the finer points of bone stacking. These days, the lights are brighter, the safety rails a little sturdier, but the mood still slips between awe and dread. There's a hush down there, even when you're surrounded by tourists in sneakers and fanny packs, snapping photos like it's Disneyland for the dearly departed. Since the 19th century, The catacombs have drawn all kinds of seekers, poets, philosophers, artists, and the morbidly curious. Victor Hugo wandered the tunnels looking for inspiration. Salvador Dali, never one to shy away from the weird, called them beautiful. For many, it's a pilgrimage, a chance to stare death square in the eye and marvel at how meticulously the city has organized its ghosts. But not everyone's on board with turning mass graves into tourist traps. Some critics argue that selling tickets to stroll through stacks of anonymous skeletons is disrespectful, reducing once living people to background props. Let's not kid ourselves. That skull you're grinning next to belonged to someone with a name, a story, maybe a killer recipe for beef bourguignon. Now they're just part of the scenery. 6 million reminders that history is written in bone, not stone. Still, the catacombs serve a purpose that goes way beyond shock value. They remind us, in the most literal way possible, of our place in the grand parade of humanity. The dead, stacked, sorted, and silent, are the very foundation of Paris. Every time you cross a bridge or sip a café au lait, remember, you're walking on bones that once carried bread, carried books, carried revolution. The living stand on the shoulders, and sometimes the skulls, of those who came before. And there's something strange, almost electric, about climbing the stairs back to daylight. The city feels louder, brighter, somehow more alive. It's as if all that proximity to death supercharges your sense of life, its fragility, its brevity, its absolute absurd beauty. Down there, in the dark, Paris shows you its oldest truth. Everything we build on bones. Someday, the city might add yours to the pile. And when it does, who knows? Maybe you'll have the best ghost stories in the bar.